I should read you something from Anasi Boys and then do questions and answers and things, and then I should sign your stuff, because you're all worried about the snow. Does anyone here have a book? Preferably a copy of Anasi Boys. Sort of close at hand, thank you. You have one of those magic upside down books, which when you open it,
I let someone loan it and they didn't put the cover
they didn't
back
put
on
the cover back on, right, did they? Take it off so I don't get thumbprints all over it. Somewhere in Graham Coates's house, the grandfather clock chimed politely 12 times. In London it was midnight. In Florida it was 7 in the evening. Either way, it was the witching hour. Mrs. Dunwoody removed the plasticated red and white check tablecloth and put it away. She said, "Who's got the black candles?" Miss Knowles said, "I got the candles." She had a shopping bag at her feet and she rummaged about in it, producing 4 candles. They were mostly black. One of them was tall and undecorated. The other 3 were in the shape of a cartoon black and yellow penguin, with the wick coming out of his head. "It was all they got," she said apologetically, "and I had to go to 3 stores until I found anything." Mrs. Dunwoody said nothing, but she shook her head. She arranged the 4 candles at the 4 ends of the table, taking the single non-penguin at the head of the table where she sat. Each of the candles sat on a plastic picnic plate. Mrs. Dunwoody took a large box of kosher salt, and she opened the spout and poured salt crystals on the table in a pile. And she glared at the salt and pushed at it with a withered forefinger, prodding it into heaps and walls. Miss Knowles came back from the kitchen with a large glass bowl, which she placed at the centre of the table. She unscrewed the top from a bottle of sherry and poured a generous helping of sherry into the bowl. "Now," said Mrs. Dunwoody, "the devil grass, the St. John the Conqueror root, and the love lies bleeding." Mrs. Bustamante rummaged in her shopping bag and took out a small glass jar. "It's mixed herbs," she explained. "I thought it would be all right." "Mixed herbs?" said Mrs. Dunwoody. "Mixed herbs? Will that be a problem?" said Mrs. Bustamante. "It's what I always use when the recipe says basil this or oregano that. I can't be doing with it. You ask me, it's all mixed herbs." Mrs. Dunwoody sighed. "Pour it in," she said. Half a bottle of mixed herbs was poured into the sherry. The dried leaves floated on the top of the liquid. "Now," said Mrs. Dunwoody, "the 4 earths. I hope," she said, choosing her words with care, "that no one here going to tell me they could not get the 4 earths, and now we have to make do with a pebble, a dead jellyfish, a refrigerator magnet, and a bar of soap." "I got the earths," said Mrs. Higgler. She produced her brown paper bag and pulled from it 4 Ziploc bags, each containing what looked like sand or dried clay, each of a different colour. She emptied each bag at one of the 4 corners of the table. "Glad somebody's paying attention," said Mrs. Dunwoody. Miss Knowles lit the candles, pointing out as she did so how easily the penguins lit and how cute and funny they were. Mrs. Bustamante poured out a glass of leftover sherry for each of the 4 women. "Don't I get a glass?" asked Fat Charlie, but he didn't really want one. He didn't like sherry. "No," said Mrs. Dunwoody firmly, "you don't. You need your wits about you." She reached into her purse and took out a small gold-coloured pill case. Mrs. Higgler turned off the lights. The 5 of them sat round the table in the candlelight. "Now what?" asked Fat Charlie. "Shall we all join hands and contact the living?" "We do not," whispered Mrs. Dunwoody, "and I do not want to hear another word out of you." "Sorry," said Fat Charlie, then wished he hadn't said it. "Listen," said Mrs. Dunwoody, "you will go where they may help you. Even so, give away nothing you own and make no promises. You understand? If you have to give somebody something, then make sure you get something of equal value in return. Yes?" Fat Charlie nearly said yes, but he caught himself in time and simply nodded. "It is good." And with that, Mrs. Dunwoody began to hum tunelessly. in her old voice which quavered and faltered. Miss Knowles also began to hum rather more melodically. Her voice was higher and stronger. Mrs. Bustamante did not hum. She hissed instead, an intermittent snake-like hissing, which seemed to find the rhythm of the humming and weave through it and beneath it. Mrs. Higgler started up, and she didn't hum and she didn't hiss. She buzzed, like a fly against a window, making a vibrating noise with her tongue and her teeth, as odd and as unlikely as if she had a handful of angry bees in her mouth, buzzing against her teeth, trying to get out. Fat Charlie wondered if he should join in, but he had no idea what sort of thing he ought to do if he did. So he concentrated on sitting there and trying not to be weirded out by all the noises. Mrs. Higgler threw a pinch of red earth into the bowl of sherry and mixed herbs. Mrs. Bustamante threw in a pinch of the yellow earth. Miss Knowles threw in the brown earth, while Mrs. Dunwoody leaned over painstakingly slowly and dropped in a lump of black mud. Mrs. Dunwoody took a sip of her sherry. Then, with arthritic fingers fumbling and pushing, she took something from the pill case and dropped it into the candle flame. For a moment the room smelled of lemons, and then it smelled simply as if something was burning. Miss Knowles began to drum on the tabletop. She didn't stop humming. The candle flames flickered, dancing huge shadows across the walls. Mrs. Higgler began to tap on the tabletop as well, her fingers knocking out a different beat to Miss Knowles's, faster, more percussive, the two drum beats twining to form a new rhythm. In Fat Charlie's mind, all the sounds began to blend into one strange sound, the humming and the hissing and the buzzing and the drums. He was starting to feel lightheaded. Everything was funny. Everything was unlikely. In the noises of the women, he could hear the sound of wildlife in the forest, hear the crackling of enormous fires. His fingers felt stretched and rubbery. His feet were an immensely long way away. It seemed then that he was somewhere above them, somewhere above everything, and that beneath him there were 5 people around a table. Then one of the women at the table gestured and dropped something into the bowl in the middle of the table, and it flared up so brightly that Fat Charlie was momentarily blinded. He shut his eyes, which, he found, did no good at all. Even with his eyes closed, everything was much too bright for comfort. He rubbed his eyes against the daylight. He looked around. A sheer rock face skyscrapered up behind him, the side of a mountain. Ahead of him was a sheer drop, cliffs, going down.
What was it like working with a mono?
What was it like working with a mono? It was really fun, and to this day, I forget that I don't speak Japanese and he doesn't speak English. Because we had such great conversations. And, somehow in my memory I've edited out the various translators, which is really kind of odd. No, it was really, really fun. I loved his work, still do. And he had never done... I'd just come off Princess Mononoke, where I'd done an awful lot of research into ancient Japanese stuff. So much more than ever got into Princess Mononoke, but I needed to do it so that I understood it. So I suddenly had all of this stuff floating around in my head. Amano wanted to do an American project, and he, bizarrely, had never done any ancient Japanese stuff. He'd always done sort of cool futuristic stuff or fantasy stuff or whatever, but he'd never done any of that. So it was new territory for both of us, but I also knew that I could rely on him in a way that made it really exciting. I actually wrote that completely fraudulent stuff in the back about how it was based on an old legend and stuff. Only because I thought at the time we were going to need some padding, and I thought, well, we can run that over about 4 or 5 pages, and it'll fill up something, and we'll use little doodles and stuff. And then we got to the end, and because Amano had done all these extra drawings, we were squished into incredibly small and unfortunately very authoritative type at the back. So somehow, I think if it had been printed much larger, everyone would have been reading this going, no, this is just part of the story. This is just Neil wittering on. But it was in very small and authoritative type at the back. And it became very obvious that everybody has believed me. And roughly monthly, I get desperate emails from librarians somewhere in the world, often in Japan, who have spent 6 months or a year trying to track this down and have now given up and in desperation are contacting me. What's next? That was good. I'm just started back again on a novel. I'd written about the first half chapter to it, and I'm now leaping in and writing chapter 4 because it's kind of a standalone and I can give it to an anthology that's been begging me for a short story. And it's sort of a little way of figuring some stuff out that I need to know of a book, the next children's book. So this is the first children's novel since Coraline, and it's called The Graveyard Book. Oh, that's a favorite literary thing to work in. Radio plays. But it's a bit like, those people who write your name on grains of rice. It's not really the kind of thing that, you don't go very wide on them. I love doing it. I love doing radio plays. I did Signal to Noise, and last year I did Mr. Punch for the BBC. Did a few for the sci-fi.com channel when they were doing it, which we brought out as 2 plays for voices, and I love them. For me, you get all of the fun of doing theatre or doing a film, but you're also engaging the imagination of the person who's experiencing it in the same way that you engage the imagination of a listener. So it's sort of like the best of all worlds. It's a lot like writing comics, except that you're sort of forcing the person listening to provide a visual track, and it's enormously fun. And if it wasn't for the need to, feed my children, I would do nothing but radio plays and live out in a cardboard box to the BBC. But I love doing them, and they're probably the most fun. And also, it's like you get it's like getting to make a movie in a weekend. And you get your cast in, and it takes an hour's radio play, basically takes 2 days to do, which is just great. You're not bored with it at the end of 2 days. There's none of that feeling you get to on a real film of, oh my God, we're in month, what is this? But it also gets you out of the house. It's really nice if you're a writer, and if there's a funny line, maybe the guy in the control room will laugh. And you'll know that it worked. As opposed to having to wait until you do the reading. So, I think it's probably radio plays of all of them. Although, I have to admit, I hesitate to call it an opera, because that has really odd connotations. Currently we're calling it a musical pandemonium. But it's an adaptation, a theatrical adaptation of The Wolves and the Wolves, my children's book. And it's being done with the National Theatre of Scotland. And I've done extra words, or it's the words from the book, and plus extra words and song lyrics and stuff like that. And I've had an enormously fun time just getting to play with that, and there's nothing like watching somebody padding their jumper with huge reams of cotton and other clothes, and a sweater sort of full of things, and then padding the backs of their calves, and then putting their feet halfway into gym shoes, and then attaching a weird kind of tail thing made out of sacking, of hessian, of burlap, and then taking a burlap wolf's head with incredibly real teeth and eyes, putting it on their head, and then shoving it through the hole in the top of their sweater. And while one arm dangles free, and suddenly becoming a wolf. And you go, real sort of weird stage magic, and you just suddenly imagine what this is actually going to be like when it happens, and when the wolves get to sing. They all sound like Tom Waits. it was an artistic decision. We said, what do the wolves sound like? They all sound like Tom Waits. Actually, that one is fun. That one, I think, goes to... It premieres in Glasgow at the end of March. And then it goes to... opens in London in April. And then it goes around Scotland. And then they're talking about bringing it to America in 2007. So I'm trying to persuade them that it really ought to come to Minneapolis, because this is the kind of place that would really appreciate scary wolves in an opera.